10 years ago, 7-year-old Daniel Mercer vanished from a small-town playground in Colorado while his mother answered a phone call just steps away. No witnesses, no leads, no trace until a scorched soccer ball marked with his name and a faded lightning bolt sticker surfaced in the aftermath of a devastating forest fire hundreds of miles from where he disappeared. The discovery reopens a case thought long cold, igniting a chain of revelations that will unearth secrets buried by time, trauma, and flame. The morning sun filtered through a high, overcast sky, casting a pale silver light over the small town of Brighton, Colorado. It was the kind of early fall day that felt like a last breath of summer. Cool in the shadows, warm in the sun. Heather Mercer zipped up her son's hoodie, tugging the sleeves over his tiny wrists before brushing the red cowlick from his forehead. Daniel giggled and pulled away, already clutching his favorite soccer ball, its white surface scuffed and marked with a peeling lightning bolt sticker. "Just 10 more minutes, okay?" Heather said, checking her watch. "Then we go home for lunch." Daniel nodded, already sprinting across the grass toward the jungle gym at Deerfield Park. He was 7 years old and full of energy, the kind of child who made everything a race, every action a game. She watched him dart around the playground, weaving between toddlers and parents with practiced ease, before settling in at the slide with a few other boys. Heather found a bench near the path and sat down, the chill of the metal seeping through her jeans. She tucked her purse beneath her feet, pulled out her phone, and glanced at the missed call from her sister, Lily. She hesitated for a moment, eyes flicking between her screen and Daniel, who was now balancing on the edge of the sandbox, arms flailing like a tightrope walker. She tapped the call back. "Hey," Heather said, pressing the phone to her ear. "Yeah, we're still at the park." "No, I haven't forgotten about Sunday. Yes, I'll bring the dip." A chuckle escaped her lips. She turned her head toward Daniel's last known location, smiling at the sound of kids laughing. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When she looked back, Daniel was gone. Heather stood, phone still in hand, her eyes scanning the playground. The slide, the sandbox, the swing set. She walked in a slow circle, her heart rate beginning to quicken. "Daniel?" she called, voice casual, not yet alarmed. Maybe he'd run to the water fountain. Maybe he was behind the climbing wall. She checked. He wasn't. Now the laughter of the other children sounded distant, muffled. Heather's breath caught as she turned a full circle and saw nothing. No red hoodie, no soccer ball. Just the breeze, stirring the fallen leaves, and the faint clang of chains on the swings. Her voice rose this time. "Daniel, sweetie, come here." Still no answer. She moved faster now, her eyes darting to every face, every corner of the park. The other parents began to notice her urgency. One woman asked if she needed help. Heather could barely speak. Her fingers trembled as she called 911. In the span of one phone call, her son had disappeared, and the world had stopped turning. Heather's voice cracked as she shouted Daniel's name again, stumbling across the park's grassy field, scanning every corner, behind every tree, beneath every bench. Her heart hammered with a panic so total it drowned out the sound of nearby children playing, the drone of passing cars, even her own thoughts. She called him over and over as if repetition might make him appear. "Daniel, Daniel, sweetie, answer me, please." A jogger paused mid-stride near the path, watching Heather with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. She couldn't respond right away. Her mouth opened, but no words came, only a ragged breath. Finally she managed, "My son, he was just here, red hoodie, 7 years old. He's gone." The jogger turned immediately, scanning the playground. "I'll help look," he said. Others were already rising from benches, abandoning conversations, gathering around her. One woman pulled her own daughter close by instinct. "When did you last see him?" she asked. Heather stared at her phone. 3 minutes ago, I was right there. I was right there. Someone called the park office. Another ran toward the recreation center across the street. The atmosphere shifted, like pressure dropping before a storm. The laughter and chatter that had filled the park only moments ago fell away, replaced by the sharp edge of urgency. Calls echoed across the grounds. Daniel Mercer, as strangers joined the search, poking through hedges, peering into trash bins, opening the doors of portable restrooms, and calling into empty tubes of playground tunnels. Heather's hands trembled as she dialed 911 again, her voice unsteady but determined. "My son is missing. I was with him at Deerfield Park. He was just here. He's gone." The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, asking her to stay on the line, to describe him, hair color, eye color, what he was wearing. Red hoodie, jeans, a little lightning sticker on his soccer ball, please. He never goes far. He wouldn't run off. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived, their sirens silenced, but their presence unmistakable. Officers fanned out, speaking with each adult in the park. A chopper thudded overhead by the hour's end, its searchlight sweeping over treetops. Heather was seated on the back of a cruiser, a blanket over her shoulders, though she couldn't feel the cold. Time bled. Hours passed like minutes, and minutes stretched into eternities. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the fields. A K-9 unit was brought in. Police asked again about recent visitors to the park, parked vehicles, strangers, anyone who might have taken a sudden interest in a child alone. There were no clear answers. No one had seen Daniel leave. No one saw who he might have left with. He had vanished, as if plucked from the earth itself. The first night passed with no answers. Heather didn't sleep. She couldn't. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of untouched tea cooling beside her, the police report spread open, its sterile lines and checkboxes incapable of containing the terror she felt. Mark paced the living room in silence, his fists clenched and jaw set, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Outside, red and blue lights still pulsed faintly from the cruiser parked at the curb, a quiet promise that someone was looking. By morning, the first tips began to roll in. A woman from 3 streets over called in after seeing the Amber Alert. She'd been walking her dog the previous afternoon and claimed to have noticed a silver sedan idling near the playground. "It didn't seem right," she said. "No license plate on the front, windows tinted. The driver looked like he was watching the kids." Police followed up within the hour. They canvassed the area, checked traffic cameras at nearby intersections, but nothing matched. The lead fizzled. Then came the report of a man with binoculars, maybe mid-30s, said a jogger who frequented the park trail. He'd seen the man earlier that week, sitting alone on a bench that faced the swing set. "Didn't look like he belonged," he said. "No kid with him, just staring." Investigators circulated a sketchy description, and local patrols kept an eye out. But no one matching that vague portrait ever turned up. Another dead end. A teenager was brought in briefly after a parent reported seeing him near the parking lot that day, wearing a dark hoodie and glancing around nervously. "He bolted when he saw me," the woman insisted. The boy, no older than 16, was found later behind the gas station, and the officers questioned him while Heather waited in the station's side room, hoping against hope. But the kid had no connection. He'd been skipping school and hiding from a truancy officer. Nothing more. Each lead was a cruel spark of hope, followed swiftly by a wave of crushing disappointment. Every phone call made Heather's heart lurch. Every police knock at the door made Mark rise too fast, only to sit down again when he heard the words, "We're still working on it." Days blurred. The search radius expanded. Flyers were posted, email alerts sent. CCTV footage scoured. People came forward earnestly, tearfully even, certain they'd seen something that might help. But each one collapsed beneath scrutiny, like ash blown from a once-burning fire. Daniel had disappeared in broad daylight, surrounded by people, and yet no one had truly seen anything. Brighton changed overnight. By the end of the week, every storefront, telephone pole, and school bulletin board was plastered with flyers bearing Daniel's face. The photo was the one Heather had picked, taken at the county fair the summer before. He was grinning, a chocolate smear on his cheek, his arms raised mid-jump on the trampoline ride. The image, once joyful, now hung everywhere like a prayer, silent and unanswered. Candlelight vigils sprung up on the park's edge, flickering gatherings of neighbors, teachers, parents. Children clutched stuffed animals, while adults stood in circles, whispering, crying, sometimes just standing still. The playground where Daniel had vanished was roped off with yellow tape at first, then reopened, then abandoned. No one wanted to be the first to send their kids back there. For many, the sight of the slide or the jungle gym was enough to summon dread, as if the ground itself had swallowed him whole. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said they'd heard there was a ransom note. There wasn't. Others claimed a registered sex offender from a neighboring town had been spotted nearby. He had an airtight alibi. The sheriff's office issued statements urging calm, but every siren in the distance set hearts racing. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter in grocery store aisles. Strangers glanced twice at lone men in parks. The town, once known for its calm pace and friendly sidewalks, now carried an invisible tension, a shared vigilance that hovered like fog. The school set up a crisis response team. Counselors met with Daniel's classmates, who were still too young to understand what had happened, but old enough to feel the sudden absence of a desk, a chair, a laugh that used to echo during recess. One little girl left a drawing in Daniel's cubby. 2 stick figures holding hands, surrounded by stars. She'd labeled it "Me and Danny in Heaven," though no one had said he was dead. The Mercers became symbols of a tragedy the town couldn't bear to forget and didn't know how to heal. Heather stopped going to the grocery store after someone hugged her in the produce aisle and whispered, "He's probably in a better place." Mark snapped at a reporter who camped outside their driveway and had to be physically pulled away. As days turned to weeks and still no new answers came, Brighton began to harden. Hope became something quieter, more private. People lit candles, left teddy bears at the park fence, and lowered their voices when passing the Mercers' home. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something had broken in their town, and it wasn't going to be fixed with time. The first suspects were the people closest to Daniel. That was how these things always went, the investigators said. Start with the inner circle and work outward. No one was spared. Mark sat stone-faced at the kitchen table as 2 detectives asked him questions he had already answered. His voice didn't shake, but Heather saw the crack in his composure each time they circled back to the same phrase. "Are you absolutely sure?" The officers wanted to know what time he got home from work, who could verify it, what mood he'd been in that morning. Mark didn't lose his temper, not until they asked whether Daniel had ever seemed afraid of him. Then his fist hit the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. Heather was next. The questions were softer in tone, but no less invasive. Had she ever felt overwhelmed? Had she ever lost her patience with Daniel in public? Did she leave him alone often? They asked about her marriage, about arguments, about her own childhood. One officer even asked if she'd ever taken medication for her nerves. "He was my baby," she snapped. "I looked away for 3 minutes. 3 minutes!" Then came the others. Daniel's uncle, Joel, Mark's younger brother, was questioned after a neighbor remembered seeing him at the park a week before the disappearance. Joel hadn't spoken to Mark in months, a falling out over money that neither of them had bothered to patch. Still, he submitted to questioning and a search of his home without hesitation. "He's my nephew, for God's sake," he said, handing over his phone records and work logs. Nothing suspicious turned up. The old babysitter, Carla Jennings, was called in next. She had watched Daniel 2 summers ago, back when Heather was still working part-time at the clinic. Carla now lived 2 towns over, working nights and raising a child of her own. She cried during the interview, swearing she hadn't seen or spoken to Daniel in over a year. "He used to call me Miss Carla," she said, holding a crumpled tissue. "He was such a sweet boy. Why would anyone think—" Her alibi checked out. And then there was the park maintenance worker, Greg Bell. He'd been trimming hedges the day Daniel disappeared, working a route that looped through the park and into the nearby bike trail. His van was parked in the south lot all morning. Someone thought he'd been watching the kids too closely. Someone else remembered nothing unusual. The police questioned him for over an hour. He denied everything and gave them access to his vehicle and locker. He had a record, an old DUI, nothing violent. Still, people whispered when they saw him afterward. Every name raised and cleared left the community more anxious. If not them, then who? If not someone they knew, then someone they didn't. And somehow that was worse. The silence between Heather and Mark stretched longer than words could bridge. In the early days after Daniel vanished, they had clung to each other, 2 halves of the same broken whole. They slept in the same bed, but neither really slept. They moved through the house like shadows, trading brief nods and mumbled reminders, food, interviews, updates from the police, but rarely looking each other in the eyes. The air between them was heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Heather spent most nights sitting by the window in Daniel's room, staring at the empty bed, the untouched shelves, the soccer trophies he had lined up himself, slightly crooked. She left the nightlight on as if he might stumble home in the dark. Mark stopped going in altogether. He said it was too much, but she accused him of avoiding the pain, of trying to move on too soon. The first time she said it, it landed like an accusation. The second time, it landed like a weapon. They fought in whispers at first, cautious not to shatter what little calm they had left. But the whispers grew sharper, louder. Mark accused Heather of being careless. How do you lose a child at a park? And Heather accused him of disappearing emotionally, of acting like Daniel was already gone. When she caught him packing up the flyers one morning, folding them neatly into a box marked June, she screamed at him so loudly the neighbor called to ask if everything was all right. It wasn't. The therapists the police had recommended never lasted long. Heather refused to see them after one asked whether she and Mark had been having marital problems before Daniel's disappearance. Mark stopped going because talking didn't bring anyone home. They still sat at the same table for meals, but the food went untouched. Heather stopped cooking. Mark began leaving for work earlier, coming home later, quietly volunteering for overnight shifts at the supply depot. When Heather asked why, he only shrugged. It's better than pacing the house. By the 3rd month, they were more like cohabitants than partners. They shared a grief so vast it became isolating. Each one held themselves responsible, and in doing so, began holding the other accountable too. The guilt was like a third presence in the house, taking up space between them, whispering doubts in the dark. Daniel was missing, but something else had gone missing too. Their trust, their tenderness. The life they'd built together now felt like a structure scorched from the inside, still standing, but hollow and crumbling. The posters faded first. The ink bled under rain and snow, curling at the edges, sun-bleached and brittle. Some were torn down by wind, others by time. A few lingered, forgotten on the back walls of gas stations or taped inside coffee shop windows. The photo of a smiling boy with a lightning bolt sticker on his soccer ball becoming part of the background noise of Brighton. The reporters stopped calling. The volunteers stopped showing up. At the 6-month mark, the search teams were officially pulled back. "Resources are limited," the sheriff said at the press conference. "We remain committed, but we are shifting to a long-term investigative strategy." It was a careful way of saying, "We have nothing." Heather kept searching. She refused to let Daniel become a memory frozen in a photograph. She scoured missing persons databases late into the night, scrolling through lists of unidentified children found across the country. She joined online forums, shared his story on message boards, emailed his photo to every social worker, shelter, and school administrator she could find. Every few months she would receive a photo from somewhere, an image from a school ID, a snapshot taken at a mall, a blurry security cam still, and for a fleeting moment she'd believe. Until she didn't. Mark tried to be supportive at first. He listened when she shared possible leads, came with her to 2 out-of-state sightings, sat next to her on overnight bus rides chasing whispers. But after a year, he stopped answering her midnight wake-ups with hope. "We have to find a way to live again," he'd said once. Heather didn't respond. She just turned back to the map, marking the next place to check. She started attending other missing children's vigils, inserting herself into other people's grief. She handed out flyers to families of the lost, tucked Daniel's story between theirs. It was as if she couldn't stop moving, couldn't stand the stillness of waiting. At home, she kept Daniel's room exactly the same. His shoes still sat by the door. His toothbrush never moved from the cup. Neighbors stopped asking how she was. They'd learned the answer was always the same. He's not gone. He's just not home yet. The case file thickened with dust. Leads dried up. Detectives were reassigned. But Heather remained, year after year, dragging the weight of a search that no one else seemed willing to carry. Time moved on in Brighton, but for Heather it remained stuck at the edge of a park bench, with the sound of her son's laughter just out of reach. By the 2nd year, Heather was no longer the woman who used to work mornings at the dental clinic and picked up Daniel from school with a juice box and a granola bar waiting in the front seat. That Heather had vanished the day Daniel did. What remained was someone new, stripped down, sharp-edged, endlessly tired, and utterly relentless. She quit her job after missing too many shifts, too many days spent chasing rumors, or locked in conversation with detectives who had nothing new to tell her. The polite sympathy of her coworkers had grown strained. The silences after she entered a room too long, the whispered, "Poor things," not quite as hushed as they thought. Heather left without a goodbye. She sold their second car to pay the retainer for the first private investigator. He promised connections, promised technology the police didn't use, promised results. He delivered a report that recycled everything she already knew, then billed her for mileage and office hours. She fired him and hired another. Then another. Each time the hope was the same, a flicker of something, a sighting at a bus stop, a child in a store security photo, a boy's voice on a 911 call that was quickly dismissed as a prank. She clung to these fragments like lifelines, convincing herself that if she just pushed hard enough, asked the right questions, knocked on the right door, she'd find him. She kept a binder with every lead, labeled and color-coded, her own makeshift case file that grew thicker than the one collecting dust in the sheriff's office. She drained her savings, canceled vacations that had already been forgotten, cashed out Daniel's college fund. When Mark protested, when he asked what they would live on, Heather told him, without blinking, that none of it mattered if Daniel wasn't home. Eventually, Mark stopped trying to reason with her. He returned to work full-time, handled the bills, spoke to the bank when Heather fell behind on the mortgage. They lived in the same house but spoke less and less, their interactions reduced to logistical briefings and silent coexistence. Heather didn't care. She didn't need understanding. She needed answers. The house filled with boxes of documents, case notes, printed emails. Walls that once held family photos now displayed maps with red pushpins and timelines of sightings, sightings that always ended the same way. Not Daniel. And yet each time a new tip came, she was reborn for a moment, breathing in the possibility like oxygen, only to be suffocated again by the truth. Her world had narrowed to a singular obsession, finding her son, no matter what it cost, no matter what it destroyed. The morning of the 10th anniversary arrived, draped in gray sky and steady drizzle, as if the town itself were reluctant to face the day. At the far end of Deerfield Park, a small white tent had been set up beside the playground, the same one where Daniel had vanished a decade earlier. Underneath it, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, the first few already filled with familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, even a few former classmates who barely remembered Daniel but had been brought by their parents. A simple banner fluttered in the breeze, in loving memory of Daniel Mercer. Heather saw it from her car and gripped the steering wheel tighter. She'd parked 2 blocks away, not by accident. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want to be stopped, consoled, handled. She just wanted to sit there, engine off, windows fogging, and wait for the speeches to end. Mark had gone ahead, dressed in his best coat, carrying a bouquet of white chrysanthemums that Heather refused to touch. He hadn't said anything that morning, just left the flowers on the kitchen counter with a note. For Daniel. For peace. Heather didn't write back. They'd asked her to speak. Someone from the city council, someone from the school board, she couldn't remember anymore. The words blurred. They'd used phrases like closure and healing, as if a tidy ceremony could fold away the last 10 years and file them under grief managed. Heather didn't want closure. She wanted her son. At the memorial, a pastor read from a small book. A woman played soft guitar. Someone from the sheriff's office gave a brief, practiced statement about the ongoing commitment to missing persons. Mark stepped up to the microphone, voice steady but flat, and thanked the community. "We don't have answers," he said, "but we have memories, and we have each other." A few people cried. Heather watched from a distance, her hands folded in her lap. When someone knocked on her window, a friend maybe, or a volunteer from the early days, she didn't roll it down. She simply shook her head and turned away. Later, when asked why she hadn't attended, she said only, "Because he's not gone." She said it not with defiance, but with certainty, like someone speaking a truth so deep it had fused with their bones. To Heather, a memorial meant an ending. And for her, Daniel's story wasn't finished, not yet. Not until she brought him home. It started with a lightning strike. In the early hours of a dry August morning, a bolt splintered through the sky above Pine Hollow, a stretch of forest in the Colorado highlands that most maps barely acknowledged. By sunrise, the fire had already spread to 10 acres. By noon, it was 50. By the end of the first day, it was a wall of flame, pushing against ridgelines and devouring everything in its path. Timber, cabins, wildlife, and time-worn secrets that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. Smoke poured across the mountain valleys like a tide, thick and choking, turning the sun to a dull red orb above. Evacuation orders went out fast. Park rangers and volunteer crews moved through the backcountry trails, checking hunting shacks and long-abandoned mines, some of which hadn't had a visitor in years. The fire didn't care. It burned through memory and ruin alike, reducing history to ash. Helicopters thumped overhead, dumping water by the ton. Bulldozers carved fire lines into the dry earth. Firefighters, streaked with soot and exhaustion, pushed deeper into the smoke-drenched hillsides, setting controlled burns to choke off the fire's advance. Locals watched from roadsides, faces turned toward the orange horizon, their homes and livelihoods waiting on the mercy of shifting winds. In the town of Elk Bend, population 312, the volunteer fire department set up a staging area at the community center. Cots lined the gym floor, and maps were tacked to every wall, covered in red marker lines that kept changing by the hour. One volunteer, a college student on break, was assigned to help clear debris near an old hunting corridor just north of Pine Hollow Creek, a narrow stretch that hadn't been maintained in years. That's where they found it. Half buried beneath blackened branches and still warm ashes was a soccer ball, scorched at the edges, but intact. The rubber surface was dirty but legible. Across one curved panel, faded by time and heat, a child's name had been written in permanent marker. Daniel Mercer. At first, it meant nothing to the cleanup crew, just a lost toy in the wreckage of a fire. But one volunteer took a photo of the ball and posted it online with a caption, "Found during Pine Hollow fire cleanup. Anyone missing this?" The image traveled fast, shared, reposted, screenshotted. Within days, it reached someone who recognized the name, someone who remembered a missing boy from Brighton. And just like that, the embers of an old mystery caught fire again. The air still smelled of smoke days after the fire line had held. Pine Hollow was a skeleton of itself, charred trees reaching upward like blackened fingers, the underbrush reduced to brittle dust. Steam curled up from the ground in places, where heat still lingered beneath the surface. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that seemed to weigh on everything it touched. Eli Navarro, a volunteer from Fort Collins, crouched near the edge of a narrow clearing, dragging a rake through the soot. His job was simple: clear debris, check for flare-ups, and mark any structural remnants that might pose danger. Mostly, he found nothing but ash and twisted metal. But that morning, as he scraped through a pile of collapsed branches, something bounced free and rolled a few feet downhill, landing with a soft thud in the dirt. It was a soccer ball. Warped slightly from the heat, one side burned, almost smooth, but still whole. Eli wiped a gloved hand across it, smearing away a layer of soot. A name was written there, faint but readable beneath the grime: Daniel Mercer, in the looping handwriting of a child or a parent, the kind meant to survive recess chaos and lost and found bins. And just above it, peeling but unmistakable, a lightning bolt sticker clung to the curve of the ball. He turned it in his hands, frowning. It had no business being out here. There were no homes nearby, no camps or schools. This part of Pine Hollow hadn't seen regular foot traffic in years. Even the nearest ranger station had been boarded up the previous season. Whoever had left it here had done so long before the fire. He showed it to his supervisor, who shrugged. "Could have been from one of those prepper cabins," he said. "Weird stuff turns up after a burn. Mark it and toss it in the salvage bin." But Eli hesitated. There was something about it, the name, the sticker, that didn't feel like just another lost toy. Later that night, he posted a photo of it online, mostly on a whim. No hashtags, no caption beyond a few words. "Found this clearing fire debris in Pine Hollow. Anyone recognize it?" He didn't expect much. By the next morning, the post had gone viral. In a town hundreds of miles away, Heather Mercer stared at her phone screen with trembling hands. She knew that ball. She'd written that name. She'd bought that lightning sticker at the county fair and helped Daniel press it onto the ball himself. It was his. After 10 years of silence, something of Daniel's had come back. The call came just after midnight, long after Heather had stopped hoping the phone would ever ring for the right reasons. She had been asleep on the couch, as she often was now, a habit formed from too many nights scrolling through missing persons forums until her body gave out. The TV played low in the background, some rerun she couldn't remember turning on. When the ringtone shattered the silence, her eyes opened instantly. Her heart jumped, not because she expected news, but because she always did, despite everything. She didn't recognize the number. Colorado area code. Her fingers trembled as she answered. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Detective Dana Keller with the Elk Bend County Sheriff's Office. I know it's late, but I need to speak with you about something we found during a fire cleanup in Pine Hollow." Heather sat upright. "What did you find?" The detective hesitated for a moment. "A soccer ball. It was discovered in a fire-damaged area. Your son's name was written on it, Daniel Mercer, with a lightning sticker. We submitted it for analysis, just in case." Heather couldn't speak. Her throat closed around the words. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe. "The lab just confirmed that DNA was recovered from the ball," Keller continued gently. "Touch DNA. It's degraded from heat exposure, but there's enough to confirm a match. It's Daniel's." Heather pressed her palm to her mouth. The sound that came out was something between a sob and a gasp. She hadn't cried like that in years, not even when they told her the case was cold, not when Mark moved out, not when she packed away Daniel's drawings one box at a time because she couldn't take the constant ache. She cried now. Keller gave her time before continuing. "We've also begun reviewing satellite data from before the fire. There were signs of habitation in the area, but nothing recent. We're coordinating with local search teams to comb through the remnants." "Are you saying—" Heather tried to find the right words. "Is it possible Daniel was there?" "We don't know yet," Keller admitted, "but it's the first physical evidence we've ever had. We're treating this as a credible development." When she hung up the phone, the house felt suddenly alive with silence, the kind that comes just before a storm. Heather stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the blank television screen, arms wrapped around herself. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel wasn't just a memory. He was a trace, a presence, and he had left something behind. The case file had sat untouched for years, stored in a metal drawer marked "Cold Cases." Children at the Brighton Police Department, its edges frayed from too many hands, too many false starts. Inside were photos that hadn't faded, only hardened. Daniel's school portrait with his crooked smile and tuft of unruly red hair. Images of the playground with yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Handwritten witness statements, most vague, many contradictory. And now, for the first time in a decade, the file was open again. Detective Jonah Reyes had just transferred from Boulder's Missing Persons Unit when the Mercer file landed on his desk. "We've got a heat signature in Pine Hollow," his captain had said, flipping him a thin memo. "Name on the ball matches a kid gone 10 years. We're giving this one another look." Jonah read through the file slowly, methodically, under the muted glow of the bullpen's old fluorescent lights. There was a rhythm to Cold Cases, the ritual of revisiting what had been passed over, forgotten, buried. He made a fresh pot of coffee, took notes in a yellow legal pad like the detectives before him, but where they saw dead ends, Jonah looked for threads, phrase that might still unravel. He flagged inconsistencies. A teen witness who'd changed their story. A timeline gap no one could account for. The early focus on family and known suspects had narrowed the investigation, maybe too much. No stranger profiles had been seriously explored. No background checks on seasonal workers in the area. No follow-up on reported sightings beyond the county line. Jonah requested full access to the evidence archive and brought in a new team, 2 younger officers and a forensic analyst from the state lab. They began reconstructing the last known hours of Daniel Mercer's life. The soccer ball with Daniel's DNA, now in evidence lockup, was photographed again under higher resolution. Even the way the ink had melted under the fire's heat was examined, each blister and warp mapped like a crime scene of its own. Heather was interviewed again, this time by Jonah himself. She noticed the difference immediately. He asked questions she'd never been asked. Not about her or Mark or where she was standing, but about the weather, the light, the way Daniel held the ball when he ran. He listened, not to find fault, but to understand. For the first time in years, the case didn't feel forgotten. It felt awake. The path to the firebreak shack wasn't marked on any map. It lay beyond the ridge, tucked into a narrow cut in the hillside where pine trees had grown close together before the fire carved a black scar through them. The shack was discovered almost by accident, spotted by a fire crew scouting for flare-ups along a shallow ravine. From a distance, it looked like a pile of debris, half covered in ash, roof sagging, smoke stains climbing up the walls like fingers trying to claw their way out. But when one of the volunteers pushed open the warped door, what they found inside didn't feel like wreckage. It felt like someone had just left. The interior was cramped, no more than 12 feet across. A single cot against the wall, a makeshift table fashioned from an old cabinet door resting on 2 cinder blocks. Empty cans lined one corner, stacked with careful precision. A lantern, a rusted camping stove. There was even a mirror, cracked diagonally but still hanging, as if someone had used it often. On the back wall, nailed to the splintered wood, was a faded towel that might have once been blue. The floor was covered in ash and scattered soot, but beneath the grime were footprints, some large, booted, others smaller, bare. Detective Reyes arrived on site within hours of the call. He stepped into the shack slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. He didn't say anything at first, just looked. There was no electricity, no running water, no sign of modern technology, but it was clear this place had been used. And used recently. The fire hadn't touched the shack directly. Somehow, it had survived. Tucked beneath the slope, half shielded by stone and brush, it had slipped past the blaze like a secret. Near the cot, Reyes found something else. Drawings. They had been tucked under a floorboard, wrapped in plastic. Crayon on yellowing paper. Stick figures. Trees. A ball with a lightning bolt. A name was scribbled in blocky handwriting on the corner of one. Daniel. The room grew still. He didn't need confirmation. Not yet. Not officially. But Reyes knew what they'd found. The soccer ball hadn't been a fluke. Someone, maybe Daniel himself, had been living here, and they had left in a hurry. The air in the shack still held the faint scent of smoke, sweat, and something else. Fear. The stillness inside the firebreak shack had the feeling of a breath held too long. No one spoke at first. The investigators moved with quiet precision, as if raising their voices might disturb whatever presence still lingered in the walls. The smell was sharp, old wood, char, and something faintly metallic, but beneath it there was another scent, human. Signs of life were everywhere. In the far corner, beneath a tarp that had melted slightly at the edges from radiant heat, was a sleeping space. Not a sleeping bag or a mattress, but a makeshift bedding of old blankets, layered with clothing that had clearly been repurposed. Sweatshirts, flannel, and even what looked like a child's coat, now threadbare and patched at the elbows. The indentation where someone had lain was still visible. Not fresh, but not long abandoned either. Detective Reyes crouched beside the bedding and lifted one of the shirts. It was stiff with dust and dirt, but small, unmistakably meant for a child. Along the collar, someone had sewn a patch over the tag. The thread was uneven. Hand done. He didn't need the forensics team to tell him what he already suspected. Someone had lived here. Someone young. On the opposite wall, just above eye level, were drawings. Dozens of them, taped and thumbtacked, some curling at the edges from moisture or smoke. They were simple: trees, stick figures, a sun with long, spindly rays. One showed a small figure holding a ball with a lightning bolt drawn beside it. In several, the same crude initials appeared again and again. D. Sometimes just that. Other times, spelled out in blocky capitals, Daniel. One drawing, pinned low to the ground, was different. It showed two figures standing under what might have been stars. One taller, one smaller. The smaller one had red scribbles for hair. Over both, a looming shape hovered, a word, undefined, jagged, like a shadow or something worse. Beneath the drawings, a pile of food wrappers had been swept into a corner. Canned goods, protein bars, empty water bottles. Most were years old, judging by the expiration dates. But some were newer, not months old, weeks, maybe, days. Whoever had stayed here hadn't just hidden. They'd survived, lived. The shack wasn't just a shelter. It had been a home, a secret carved out of isolation and necessity. A place where someone had drawn pictures, curled up against the cold, eaten rationed meals, and clung to a world far from the one that had forgotten them. Daniel had been here, and maybe, just maybe, he still was. The deeper they moved into Pine Hollow, the more it felt like they were chasing a ghost through smoke. Detective Reyes and the search team followed the terrain beyond the firebreak shack, venturing into the blackened maze of trees and scorched earth that had once been dense forest. The fire had devoured much of the underbrush, leaving behind a strange, skeletal quiet. Charred trunks stood like sentinels, and the only sound was the crunch of boots on brittle ash. The air still carried a trace of heat, even though the flames had passed days ago, but signs remained, if you knew where to look. Reyes paused at a break in the tree line where the undergrowth had been cleared not by fire, but by hand. The vegetation here had been intentionally trampled, pushed aside to create a narrow, hardened trail winding through the forest. He crouched and touched the ground. It was compacted, smoothed by repeated foot traffic, not wide enough for vehicles, too consistent for an animal path. Someone had walked this route many times. A few yards in, they found footprints, barefoot and small, the toes pressed deep into soot-softened earth. Some were overlapped, others half obscured by debris kicked up during the fire, but they were there, unmistakable. They followed the trail in silence, Reyes moving ahead of the others, his eyes scanning the edges of the path, noting how it curved carefully around the thickest trees and natural landmarks. Whoever had lived out here had understood the land, had learned how to survive in it. Further in, the trail forked, one path leading toward an overhang of stone and brush that had been used as crude shelter, blackened now, but still intact. A hollow log lay nearby, split down the middle and stuffed with empty food wrappers, the same brands they'd found back at the shack. It was a stash, tucked away from the main shelter, hidden under debris. There were other signs, too. Fire pits, long gone cold, tree bark stripped in narrow, even lines, likely used for kindling or rope, a scavenger's signature, a survivor's trail. Reyes stood still for a long moment, the silence pressing in around him like fog. This wasn't just a campsite. It was a network. Paths, supplies, hideouts. It suggested time, effort. A person who had not only been out here, but who had lived out here for a long time. Someone had made a life in this smoke-shrouded wilderness, and it was starting to look a lot like that. Someone might be Daniel Mercer. Eli Mercer, no relation to the family, though the name coincidence turned more than a few heads, had worked the Pine Hollow region for 16 years before he retired quietly and moved into a small A-frame cabin just beyond the eastern ridge. People in Elk Bend called him the Fire Ghost, half affectionate, half wary. He rarely came into town, didn't own a TV, lived off his pension, his goats, and his garden. The forest, he always said, was the only thing that made sense to him. Detective Reyes found him sitting on the edge of his porch with a mug of something that smelled like pine and smoke. His beard was thick, his hands weathered, and his eyes sharp in a way that suggested age had done nothing to dull his memory. "I saw the post," Eli said before Reyes had even introduced himself. "The ball." Reyes nodded, already pulling out his notebook. "You recognize it?" "No," Eli said simply, "but I know who it belonged to." He sipped his drink and stared out at the trees, half burned, half standing. "I saw him," he said. "Not the day he disappeared. God, no. This was maybe 4-5 months ago, late winter. Snow was just melting. I was walking a northern firebreak line, old habit, and there he was." Reyes leaned forward. "Where?" "Just past Dry Creek. Skinny kid, red hair, dirty as hell. He was standing at the edge of a ridge, holding a stick like a spear. Thought he was a hallucination at first. I called out to him. He bolted." Eli scratched at his beard. "Fast little thing, disappeared into the brush before I could follow." "Did you report it?" Eli hesitated. "I tried. Told a guy from forestry. He shrugged it off, said it was probably a hiker's kid or some local teen playing survivalist." His voice tightened. "But I know what I saw. That boy wasn't out there for fun. He was living out there." Reyes showed him the drawings found in the shack. Eli studied them closely, his expression shifting. "That's him," he said quietly, tapping a picture of the stick figure with spiked hair and a lightning bolt on a ball. "That's the boy." "You're sure?" "As sure as I am. I've lived more years in these woods than most people have had hot dinners." For the first time in the investigation, they had a witness. Not a memory clouded by time, not a second-hand story, but a man who had seen Daniel, alive, moving, surviving. The fire had brought destruction, yes, but it had also burned away the barriers that had hidden a boy in the forest for far too long. With the drawings confirmed and Eli's sighting no longer just a curiosity, the investigation took a sharp turn. For the first time in a decade, detectives stopped asking where Daniel had gone and began asking who had taken him. Detective Reyes returned to Brighton with a new mandate: dig deeper. Not into the park, not into the family, but into the people who had vanished from the margins, the ones who hadn't made headlines, the ones who slipped away quietly around the time Daniel did. The list wasn't long, but it was strange. There was a couple who'd sold their house the same summer Daniel disappeared. No forwarding address, no close family, no social footprint since. Gerald and Nadine Hunter. They had fostered once, briefly, but the placement had been pulled for noncompliance. The caseworker who filed that note had since retired. When tracked down, she barely remembered the name. Odd people, she recalled. They didn't talk much, but they were always polite. Kept their windows covered. Another name emerged from the corner of an old report. Randall Deeks, former military, turned prepper, known for preaching about society's collapse at town hall meetings. He'd lived in a trailer on the outskirts of Elk Bend, not far from where Daniel's ball had been found. He disappeared 6 months after Daniel did, telling neighbors he was going dark. Nobody followed up. His land was sold at auction. The trailer sat empty until it burned in a separate brush fire 2 years later. Reyes sifted through dozens of leads like this, people who had withdrawn from society around the same time a 7-year-old boy vanished. Some were just broken people seeking quiet. But some had room, had motive, had space to hide a child. Then there were the survivalist camps. There weren't many, and the few that existed were buried deep in the folds of Pine Hollow's less-traveled woods. No electricity, no phones. Some didn't register births, didn't report deaths. They lived off-grid, off-record, off-responsibility. The kind of places where a boy could grow up without ever seeing a school, a doctor, a birthday party. Reyes didn't know yet who had taken Daniel, but someone had helped him stay hidden for a long, long time. Someone had taught him to live in the woods, to build shelters, to disappear. Someone had built him a life far from the world that was still looking for him. And now the fire had exposed their trail. They found the cabin by accident. A drone sweep had picked up a rectangular heat anomaly along the western slope, just beyond the area cleared by foot patrol. The fire had ripped through that part of the forest with such force that even the rock still felt warm beneath the boots of the search team. But tucked behind a ring of scorched pines, half collapsed and blackened with soot, the structure emerged like a ghost from the smoke. The roof was mostly gone. The walls leaned inward, sagging under their own weight. The windows had burst, leaving only shards clinging to the frames. But what remained of the cabin told a story, one built from soot, silence, and ash. Detective Reyes stepped inside first, careful of the sagging floorboards. The interior was a ruin of heat-warped furniture and melted glass. A rusted cot was bolted to one wall, burned through at the center, and near the hearth lay a pile of books and papers, half consumed but not entirely lost. The corner of a notebook, charred around the edges, still bore legible ink. He lifted it gently, using tweezers from the evidence kit. The handwriting was tight, methodical, pages and pages of it, and though much had been destroyed, enough remained to make the hair on his arms stand. The boy watches the flames and does not cry. I tell him it means the world is purging itself. He nods like he understands. Maybe he does. Further down, another entry. He was sent to me. I found him crying beneath the tall trees. No parents, no name, just a ball and a storm inside him. I gave him a name. I gave him purpose. Reyes felt the words sink in like cold water. There were more pages, ramblings about survival, faith, a cleansing fire. Paranoia stitched through the margins, mentions of government betrayal, of society's rot, and the coming need to start over. Again and again the same phrase, the boy must be untainted. One line struck like a nail. He still asks about the woman. I tell him she was a lie. Behind the ruined stove, a steel box was discovered, welded shut and bolted to the wall. Inside were carefully folded clothes, child-sized, mismatched, patched at the seams. A toothbrush, a lock of red hair wrapped in cloth. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a doctrine, a cell built on delusion. Daniel hadn't just survived in these woods. He had been kept here, shaped by someone who believed the fire could save them, someone who thought the world beyond the trees had already burned. The office smelled like lavender and leather. A deliberate choice, Heather assumed, meant to make the room feel soft, safe, less clinical. But nothing felt safe to her. Not after what she had read in the reports, not after hearing about the shack, the drawings, the journal pages with her son's name warped into someone else's idea of salvation. Dr. Lena Osborne sat across from her, a trauma psychologist contracted by the Bureau, her voice calm and precise. She had read the case file twice before Heather walked in. She didn't waste time. When a child is taken, she began, we expect trauma. But when they're kept, for years in isolation, under control, we have to prepare for something more complicated. Heather nodded, though she barely understood. Her hands clenched together in her lap, twisting the fabric of her sleeve. I just want to know what he's going through, what he's going to remember, if he'll recognize me. Dr. Osborne took a breath. It depends on how long he was isolated, whether there were others, what stories he was told. Children don't just absorb what you say to them, they build entire worlds around it, especially when they're alone. Heather blinked. Are you saying he might not know who he is? I'm saying he may have a different version of himself, one that was fed to him slowly, carefully, over years. He might remember his name, or he might believe he was born in those woods, that you never existed. The thought landed like a blow. Heather looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring was gone now, but the pale line remained, like memory etched into skin. He was kind, she whispered, empathetic. He used to cry if a bug got stepped on. Will that still be there? Dr. Osborne softened. Some parts of him will survive, but others may have been suppressed, redirected. In long-term captivity, especially with ideological conditioning, survival depends on obedience. Attachment becomes confused with fear. Heather stared at the window, not seeing the trees outside. Just the years, 10 of them. She had imagined the pain, the loneliness, but not this, not the erasure. He might not call you Mom, Dr. Osborne said gently. Not at first. But if there's a bond still buried in him, it can come back. Not overnight, not easily, but it's possible. Heather nodded slowly. Her heart ached with a new fear. Not that Daniel was gone, but that when she finally saw him again, he might look her in the eye and not know who she was. Or worse, he might know exactly and still turn away. The footage arrived in the middle of the night, a silent whisper delivered through a secure server link labeled Pine Hollow Sector 7B, Night Surveillance. Reyes sat alone in the operations trailer, nursing a coffee gone cold, eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Most of the search teams had gone home for the night. Outside, the forest exhaled its damp breath into the dark, the smell of smoke still lingering. He clicked play. The drone's camera panned slowly across the charred forest edge, its thermal sensor picking up the ambient heat of the land. The trees were skeletal now, tall black silhouettes stripped of their underbrush. A few deer appeared in the early frames, their bodies glowing pale against the dark terrain, and then disappeared again into the shadows. Reyes let it run. At minute 6, something changed. Near the upper edge of the screen, half obscured by a ridge and a fallen pine, a small figure appeared, briefly, hesitantly. It wasn't an animal. The shape was upright, humanoid, moving low to the ground, but with the uneven gait of a person unfamiliar with open space. The heat signature was faint but undeniable. He froze the frame. The figure paused, crouched behind a thicket of scorched brush. Then it moved again, fast this time, ducking low, disappearing behind a cluster of rocks before emerging on the other side. It stopped near the base of a tree and pressed its back to the trunk, head turned as if listening. It was careful, measured, not panicked. Reyes leaned in, heart hammering. The timestamp was 3 nights ago, close enough to matter. The coordinates placed the movement just over a mile from the firebreak shack. Within walking distance, especially for someone who knew the terrain like a second skin. He scrubbed the footage forward. The figure didn't return, but the impression lingered, burned into his mind like the heat signature itself. A child-sized frame, alone, navigating the wreckage like it was home. He picked up his phone. Within hours, a team was mobilized, drones redeployed, ground units fanned out from the point of last contact. No stone left unturned this time. No delay. Back in Brighton, Heather's phone rang just before dawn. "They saw something," the voice on the line said. "Something small. Something moving." And just like that, 10 years of silence cracked. Not a shout, not a scream, just a whisper from the trees. They found him at dusk, when the light folded soft and golden through the trees, casting long shadows over the ash-coated ground. The search team had been combing the area for hours, weaving between burnt stumps and soot-streaked rocks, every step deliberate, every rustle worth investigating. It was Officer Calder who spotted the movement, just a flicker at first, like a deer startled by its own reflection. But then it moved again, and this time it didn't bolt. He was crouched at the base of a half-burned pine, nearly camouflaged by dirt and soot. His limbs were drawn in tight, body curled like a question mark, head tilted down beneath a hood frayed at the seams. He looked more like a shadow than a boy. "Daniel?" Calder asked softly, careful not to spook him. The boy didn't answer. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just stared with wide, glassy eyes, his lips chapped and bloodied, his skin pale and streaked with soot and scratches. His hands clutched a stick, carved to a sharp point, held close like it meant safety. Reyes stepped in behind Calder, heart pounding. "We're not here to hurt you," he said. "We've been looking for you." Still nothing. But then Reyes saw the logo. Faded, cracked with age, barely legible across the chest of the boy's hoodie. Brighton Elementary School. A lightning bolt stitched beneath it, almost worn away. Reyes swallowed hard. The team moved slowly, hands open. They didn't reach for him. They waited. Minutes passed. Then the boy's eyes flicked to Reyes, and for a heartbeat, something shifted. Recognition, or maybe just exhaustion. The stick slipped from his grip. His body sagged. Paramedics moved in, gently, as if he were made of glass. He didn't speak, but he didn't resist either. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket. One of them offered water. He stared at it like he didn't remember what it was, then took a tentative sip. When they asked his name, he blinked slowly and whispered, voice barely audible, "Daniel." And then again, as if trying it on for the first time. At the base camp, Heather waited. When they brought him in, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket, a child who had become a ghost, she stood frozen. Daniel's eyes passed over her like she was just another face. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. But he didn't call her Mom. Not yet. The hospital room was quiet but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls like a held breath, brittle and heavy. Daniel, if that was still his name, sat curled on the edge of the bed, legs pulled up to his chest, blanket clutched in both fists like it might keep him anchored. His eyes flitted from corner to corner, never resting, never settling. The overhead lights were dimmed, but even that seemed to overwhelm him. Heather sat just a few feet away, not daring to move closer. He wouldn't look at her, not yet. Doctors had examined him first, gently, methodically. He was malnourished, underweight for his age, but not broken. His vitals were stable. No visible signs of recent physical abuse. His hands bore small scars, some fresh, some old, some made by nature, others perhaps by fear or punishment. But it was his silence that unsettled them the most. He'd spoken only once in the hours since they brought him in. They'd asked him his name. He blinked, then turned to the nurse with a voice as light as wind through dry leaves. "I don't know." Heather had stepped into the doorway just in time to hear it. Her knees nearly buckled. They tried again later. Reyes came in. A therapist sat with him. They asked if he knew where he was, if he remembered the fire, if he remembered the forest. He answered in pieces. There were trees. There was a man. He said I was safe. Then finally he looked at Heather for the first time, not with recognition, but with caution, as if she were a stranger who had wandered into his quiet world. She smiled, soft, trembling, aching with 10 years of waiting. He studied her like she was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. And then, barely above a whisper, he asked, "Am I real?" Heather's breath caught. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. The therapist answered first, gently. "Yes, Daniel, you're real. You're safe now." But Daniel just looked down at his hands, frowning like he wasn't sure what that meant. Later, he pressed his face to the window and watched the rain fall against the glass like something foreign, something impossible. He didn't ask about home. He didn't ask about her. And when he was alone, he whispered the question again, softer this time, to no one. "Am I real?" The memories came in shards. They surfaced without warning, fractured, blurred around the edges like dreams half remembered after waking. Sometimes Daniel would sit quietly for hours, staring into a corner of the room, unmoving. Other times he would flinch at the sound of certain voices, recoil from fluorescent lights, or jerk awake from sleep drenched in sweat, his breath short, hands clenched. The doctors called it trauma response. The therapists called it memory integration. But Heather saw it for what it was. A boy trying to piece himself back together with the broken tools someone else had given him. One night, under the soft red glow of a nightlight, he spoke without being asked. "There was a man," he said, eyes fixed on the wall. "He called himself Father John." Heather didn't interrupt. "He wasn't a priest," Daniel added quickly, as if afraid of being misunderstood. "He said the real world was sick, that people like you had forgotten how to live. He said the trees were clean." His voice drifted. "The forest was home." He didn't cry. He didn't blink. It was as if he were reciting something he had been told over and over until it stopped sounding strange. "There were rules," he said. "We had to pray before eating, not to God, to the fire. He said it watched over us." Heather sat perfectly still, her knuckles white around the blanket in her lap. "If we didn't listen, if we disobeyed—" He faltered. "He had a belt. But it wasn't always that. Sometimes he'd make me stay in the pit. He said darkness would teach me." The therapist gently asked what the pit was. "A hole," Daniel replied. He dug it himself, said it was the earth's way of taking bad thoughts. He scratched at his wrist absently. I'd have to stay there until I was quiet again. They asked him how long he had been there. He didn't know. Time didn't mean anything, he said. Only the sun and the fire. When they asked about the fire that tore through Pine Hollow, his voice dropped to a whisper. He said one day it would come, that it would take everything away, that we'd be safe in the smoke. "Did you set the fire, Daniel?" He didn't answer. But later, in his drawings, they saw a figure standing at the edge of flames, holding a match. Not Father John. The figure was small and wore a hoodie with a lightning bolt. The hospital room had changed. The sterile white walls now held paper drawings taped beside the window, stick figures, trees, a crooked sun in orange crayon. Daniel's name was written in the corner of each one, some backward, some carefully corrected. A small victory, the therapist had called it. A sign of returning self. Heather called it hope. She sat beside him every day, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting, breathing in rhythm with his silence. She brought photo albums, books he used to love, his favorite cereal in a Ziploc bag. She read aloud softly from dog-eared chapter books he wouldn't yet look at. She didn't expect conversation. She wasn't waiting for hugs. She was waiting for the spark. It came quietly. One afternoon, as she folded a blanket across his lap, he touched her wrist. Just 2 fingers, feather light. His eyes didn't meet hers, but his lips moved. "You smell the same." Heather didn't cry. Not then. She nodded, swallowing the ache that rose like a wave in her throat. "So do you," she whispered, though it wasn't true. He smelled like pine and smoke and too many years lost. but underneath it there was something familiar, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. Daniel's treatments began slowly: occupational therapy, trauma work, basic reintegration. He flinched at alarms and couldn't tolerate overhead lights for more than a few minutes. He didn't like closed doors. He struggled with mirrors. He asked often, "Is this real?" Sometimes, late at night, Heather heard him whisper to the window, as if waiting for an answer. But something in him was reaching forward. When the prosecutor came to speak with Heather, she was told that Father John, identified now as Jonathan Reeds, a former corrections officer gone off-grid, would face multiple federal charges. The journals were enough. The forensic evidence was enough. Daniel's eventual testimony, if he chose to give it, would only reinforce what they already knew. This man had stolen a child and shaped him with fear. Heather asked when the trial would be. The prosecutor answered, "Soon." But for her and for Daniel, justice wasn't just a court date. It was 1,000 small steps toward reclaiming a life, a slow rebuilding of trust, memory, identity. One evening, as she read aloud beside his bed, Daniel looked up and met her eyes. "Mom," he said, testing the word like it might fall apart in his mouth. Oh, it didn't.